Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Performance Cafe. It is lovely to have you here with me today. And today we've got a really interesting subject because so much has been said about, self-awareness. We should be self-aware. I think, in fact, a couple of weeks ago, I actually quoted a magazine article that said that, only 10% of people are considered to be truly self-aware. And so I thought, it's so interesting. Hasn't it just become one of those things we say, but do we really understand what it means? So I thought we'll jump into self-awareness today and what's the best way to use it? Because I sometimes think people will say, oh, I've been seeing a therapist, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a coach. I've been doing the work. I'm self-aware. And I think sometimes it shows up in different ways for different people. And sometimes it shows up that people might understand themselves, but they don't action it into some form of doing. So I don't know if any of you have listened to me before. If you have, welcome. My name is Ines Berger, and I'm your host today. If you've listened to me before, you might have heard me say this, but when we learn about ourselves, and we see this, I'm a strengths coach, and we often see this when people understand something new about themselves and they have that aha moment. They're like, I never knew. That's fantastic. Absolutely marvelous. But that's a bit like a rocket launching. It goes nowhere, right? It just sort of like it launches, there's lots of lights, camera action, and then it just fizzles and comes back down to earth. My goal as a coach is to get people to go to the moon. So let's launch using this new information. That's so fantastic. But that's the knowledge, right? How do we turn that into being? How do we turn that into a change or different behaviors, different ways of thinking, all that kind of stuff, so that we can sustain what we learned? It's not an interesting thing like, oh yeah, someone said that, but I never did anything with it. So firstly, let's take a look at what is self-awareness. And I've got a couple of notes here for us to look at. So the psychologists Shelley Duvall and Robert Wicklund proposed the definition that self-awareness is the ability to focus on yourself, so your actions, your thoughts, and your emotions, and to evaluate when they don't align with your internal standards, values, beliefs, whatever those systems are for you. You see, the way that they see it is that actually we are not our thoughts. I'm going to say that again because that's how big it is. We are not our thoughts. And it sounds so strange to actually hear that sentence, but if you think about it, that internal monologue that we often play, we believe ourselves. That's just the thought. That's not who we are. So we can stand aside from our thoughts, our behaviors, and our emotions, look at them and say, okay, what is this? What is happening here? How is it playing out? What does it mean to me? And that is self-awareness. So I'll give you an example for myself. I saw a client yesterday. We had a really great session. The client left very happy. And I found that I was actually a little flat after the session, which is interesting because normally when I'm fulfilling my purpose, I find it energizing. And then I realized that in that session, something had happened that I felt I had not dealt with the situation well enough. Now, notice here, the client left entirely happy. The client was not disappointed. But I then got fixated on the fact that if I'd done that little thing wrong, what's the impact? What's going to happen? And so, if I was not self-aware, I would have let that go into rumination and I would have let that freak me out entirely. And yeah, freak, of course, is a very, it's a learned term. On the other hand, when I realized that, I realized from self-awareness what it was, why it was triggering me, and what the need was that I was bringing to the table in that moment. And because of that, I could then sit back and go, okay, this is the right way to deal with the situation. And actually, it's a me thing. It's not a client thing. So I don't need to feel bad because the client was not impacted. But I had to then sit and think, okay, how do I take care of me in this process with self-compassion, right? So Self-awareness is this ability to keep on self-evaluating. And that's why you will hear lots of people talk about self-awareness, like, journal, meditate. All that they're asking us is to get quiet and listen and see where we're coming from, understand ourselves. It's so interesting. In therapy, we sometimes ask people, would you treat a best friend the way you treat yourself? And the only time that people really can answer that question is if they sit back and actually become aware of how they treat themselves, right? Self-awareness. So self-awareness, I'm now talking about it as if it's the great hope of the world, which I kind of think it is. But I want you to also understand one thing, that a journey along self-awareness is not instant clarity and everything is okay. Sometimes becoming self-aware does ask us to dig deep. It can be kind of difficult. And we might have to touch on topics that we thought had been resolved, we thought had been dealt with, but yet here it is coming up for us again. But it's really sitting and paying attention to those topics and working with them that help us to understand where we come from and who we are. The difficult thing with it, however, is that what we do with it is the next level of detail. So I spoke about self-awareness, I spoke about understanding myself and how I had to deal with myself compassionately. But some people will actually use self-awareness as a finite, unchangeable thing. My apologies. So in this process, what they do is they go, this is who I am, I'm not going to change, right? They become entirely change resistant. Understanding yourself doesn't mean that you can't grow. Understanding yourself just means I know where I'm at right now, and I know how I need to be and what I need to do now. But that doesn't mean that you cannot grow, that you cannot change. We sometimes have that when we do work in large groups and we do personality assessments like the Enneagram or again the strengths. Strengths is not personality, but we do the strengths assessment with them. And they go, these are my strengths. I'm not going to change. And they're right. They're not going to change and they shouldn't. They don't need to change. But you can still grow within that profile. You can still become more you, become a better version of yourself and have more self-insight in that. Something else that people kind of lose a little bit is when they become self-aware, they lose their spontaneity a little bit because they go, oh, I can't, or I wouldn't normally do that, right? Again, getting stuck in that self-awareness instead of understanding the baseline and moving forward. Something else is perfectionism. So this sort of loops the other way, where instead of being resistant to moving forward, they go, well, if this is me, I've got to be the most me. I've got to be the exquisite, the bestest version. I sound like TikTok. The bestest version of myself in this particular case. And I always have to be this exceptional expression of myself. And that becomes a little perfectionistic. That also doesn't really help us much. And then I've already spoken about self-criticism, but once we have that self-awareness, I could have said, oh, innocent, there you go again. You're triggered by a client. Really, must you make everything about? I could have gone down that self-criticism route. Self-criticism is another way that we actually block off. And that's why we called this episode Self-Awareness Compass or Shield, because those 4 things I just mentioned form a shield. They stand between me and my future, my best expression of myself, my relationship with others, because of course, self-awareness is both how we understand ourselves and how we see how others understand us. So we don't want to be armored up. Brene Brown says, I want to read it here for you. It's not fear that gets in the way of showing up. It's armor. It's the behaviors we use to protect ourselves. And I love Brene Brown dearly. And so that's what happens. We use self-awareness as a way to push people away. And I think what we want to do is we would rather want to use self-awareness as a compass. So how do we do that? So firstly, we take a look at things like understanding those triggers. Remember when I said we do the work? We understand why these things trigger us. Because when I understand why something triggers us, cognitive psychology says already just the understanding, just the awareness reduces that impact. But also, when we then talk through it, understand how and why and how this shows up, how the trigger shows up, well, in that case, we know how to manage it. We know from emotional intelligence. Remember, the first steps of emotional intelligence is I understand myself and how to manage myself. So we understand that in that part, we understand the fullness of what is happening over here. I understand what triggers me, why it triggers me. I also understand another thing. I understand the values and the beliefs that I use that create this. Because whatever happened in the past, it establishes now as a value or a belief. And so from that perspective, I understand what I will and will not stand for. It also helps us to evaluate the validity of those values and beliefs and whether they serve us or not. Then the next thing is have grace when you overstep. That is something I've introduced you guys to Tony, right? Tony, for those of you who don't know, is my inner critic. Tony and I have long discussions sometimes. Tony does need a lot of work sometimes. And that inner Tony will go, you've done it again, haven't you? How dare you? You know better. You tell other people to do this better. Okay, so that's a typical Tony moment, right? Have grace. The reason I say this is because we all are going to fail. We are going to do it wrong. We are going to inadvertently tick people off. No one actually wakes up. It's a firm belief of mine. No one wakes up in the morning and goes, I'm going to see how difficult I'm going to be today. We don't. We make those mistakes we call them mistakes because we make them by mistake, right? We don't mean to. Have grace. And then I want to point you to last week's video on when you've made the mistake. Move from shame to guilt, because feeling shameful, feeling bad about yourself doesn't help. Moving to guilt means that you are moving into that space where you want to go and make amends and go and make the amends. And so self-compassion, self-love, we've heard so much about it. Use that, because you're not going to be perfect all the time. No one is. And then lastly, and this is my favorite topic of all times, is how about applying a bit of the growth mindset? When you come up against something that that's triggered you, that you've done wrong, how's about going, I haven't gotten that right yet. Now, for those of you who haven't heard me carry on about the growth mindset, in essence, the growth mindset says that there's nothing that we cannot learn. There's nothing that we can't become. But the biggest problem is often a fixed mindset. It's like, oh, I'm not clever enough. I'm not good enough. I'm not this enough. I'm not that enough. I'm not wealthy enough. I don't live in the right country. I don't have access to the right technology. And with growth mindset, the most powerful word is yet. I can't do it yet. I haven't figured it out yet. I've not managed to do it yet. And then set about fixing that. So from that perspective, I think then self-awareness becomes a compass and not a shield. It becomes a thing that starts moving us in a general direction towards more of what we want to be, instead of being this shield that we hold up for ourselves. And I want to refer to Brené Brown once again, where she says, armor suffocates courage and cages our hearts. The goal is to create spaces where armor is neither necessary nor rewarded. And I think that's just it. It's about continuously growing and moving away from the armor and knowing that the path is not going to be straight. I think some of you might have heard me say before, I had a boss who used to be a pilot, not an airline pilot, but a pilot. And he said, do you realize that when you fly from Cape to Cairo, all the little pictures show this beautiful straight line. What happens is more like this, because you're flying from beacon to beacon. So let your compass take you from beacon to beacon until you get to that place where your self-awareness serves you and where it does for you what you need to have done. And in the meanwhile, give it that room to grow and to get more. So I think that's all that I have to share with you today. If you've enjoyed the stream, you're looking for more, we record these and upload them after the fact as videos to YouTube and Facebook, and we turn them into podcasts, and you can find these on all our platforms. Related articles can be found on my website, performforward.com. And then I will be hosting another live stream next week, Wednesday at 9 a.m. SAST, that's GMT -2. As always, if you've got any questions or suggestions for topics, please do leave a comment on your platform of choice, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. And then, time for more coffee. Have a great day.